1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret not to be told. You've probably heard that magpie rhyme, or at least a variation on it, probably several times. There are other variations which involve weddings, funerals, and all other things in between. But why exactly are magpies so reviled in folklore, and how else do they appear as forms of divination? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are into the final weekend of June, which I'm sure you've already noticed if you are listening to these as they come out. If not, have a lovely part of the year whenever you are listening to it. Anyway, we are finishing off the strange miscellany month with magpies and magpie rhymes, which was a request by Luca as part of my requests form that I have. The link is in the show notes if there is something that you would like to request for the future. And I am also very much keeping an eye on the window where the room where I'm recording at the moment, because there's quite a few magpies where I live, and quite honestly they're like the car alarm of the bird world, so I'm sort of expecting at least one of them to start shouting outside the window, because it's like they know when I'm recording. So this time I'll leave them in, but you would not believe the number of times I've had to edit out that horrible cackling noise that they make whenever I've been doing these episodes. But anyway, let's just crack right on, really, rather than having a lengthy intro, because you're here to learn about magpies. Now, magpies are an incredibly common sight around Britain, and also they're quite well represented in Europe as well. And as you might imagine, they do appear quite often in British bird lore as both omens of death and as a fixture in a very popular form of divination. Now, according to links at druidry.org, there are actually 20 species of magpie and tree pie, and the common magpie is exactly that in the British Isles because it is one of Europe's most common birds. Now, originally, magpies were actually known as the pie, thanks to their pied plumage, and someone then added mag in the 19th century, which means chatterer. And yes, you can actually train them to talk, although I'm not entirely sure why you would want to. Now, I was quite surprised to learn this, but the common magpie actually pairs for life, although that's slightly less impressive when you learn that the average lifespan is 2.5 years. And in some areas, magpies are actually the second most prolific predator of songbirds after cats. Magpies will eat carrion, but they're not as strongly associated with it as ravens are. So how exactly did magpies accrue such negative associations, and also how many variations of their famous rhyme is there? We are going to find out. Now, first of all, we're going to have to start out with the magpie as an omen of death. And yes, there are lots of death omens involving birds, but these are usually crows, ravens or owls. And if you want to learn anything more about their folklore, I do have an exclusive podcast episode about them for Patreon supporters. If you become a supporter at the $3.50 a month or higher tier, you will be able to get access to that, and the link is in the show notes. But back to magpies. Originally, they were also considered omens of death. And these omens actually cover quite a broad range of behaviour from the birds as well. Now, this might include magpies hovering over you, preceding you as you went to church, or cackling on your roof. Any of those things basically meant somebody was going to die. And the roof cackling magpie was especially unlucky if a sick person lay inside the building. I did also find one particular superstition in Wales that a magpie hovering over a person's head meant that they were going to be decapitated. I've no idea how common that actually was, but that is particularly what the belief said. And a magpie tapping on your window meant that death would touch your household. Now, over time, these quite deathly omens did morph into more general bad luck, and you do sort of find that rather than them being harbingers of doom, they just basically mean that there's going to be a bit of a rotten time ahead instead. Now, in Westmoreland and North Lancashire, they actually had a range of superstitions about magpies. There was a whole section on them in one article, which is why I'm kind of dwelling on them here. But for them, seeing a lone bird was particularly unlucky, which we will come back to, but it was also really unlucky if it actually just looked right at you. And I think being eyeballed by a magpie would be a bit of a weird sensation anyway, but if you believe that seeing one looking at you is bad luck, but then I suppose that would be doubly more so. Now, if you do see a single bird, you can draw a cross on the ground to avert the bad luck that it brings. Alternatively, you can say, magpie, magpie, chatter and flee, turn up thy tail and good luck fall me. You can also take off your hat, bow and wish the magpie a good day, or you can spit over your left shoulder, you can turn around 3 times, or cross your fingers and say, I cross the magpie crosses me, bad luck to the magpie and good luck to me. Any of those options should apparently avert the bad luck that magpies apparently bring. Now remember, this is if you see a lone magpie. William Henderson also suggests that what you should do if you see a lone magpie is then look out for a crow, because apparently seeing the crow then disperses any of the bad luck which the magpie might have brought. And I thought that was a particularly interesting one, considering quite a lot of people would consider crows bad luck, but apparently in this case it's almost like a weird version of bird top trumps, I suppose. But anyway, Henderson actually relates a tale from his own childhood, and bearing in mind his book's from 1879, you can sort of work backwards as to when this would have happened. And in this particular anecdote, he was driving an old woman to see a friend in County Durham. And obviously this would have been in a horse and cart, not like a BMW or something. And without warning, she seized the reins and brought the horses to a halt. Following her gaze, Henderson saw a magpie crossing the road. The woman absolutely demanded that the turn back wouldn't go any further, and she insisted that they take a different route as a result. And it was all because of the fact that she'd seen the single magpie crossing their path, and she was like, nope, not going down there, going somewhere else. Meanwhile, and this is quite an alternative to that, in Essex, far from thinking that magpies brought bad luck if they crossed your path, they thought that they brought good luck with them if they crossed your path. And if you saw 3 magpies, it either meant death or a letter was coming. I have a feeling that sometimes people might have been getting letters to announce deaths, so you probably would have been able to get both of them at the same time. But this concept of counting magpies really does lie at the heart of a particular form of divination, and it's known as Ornithomancy, or literally divination by bird. And a similar form of divination actually relates to which bird a woman sees on Valentine's Day to predict her future husband's career. Now, this form of divination of ornithomancy is very different from augury, which is also divination by bird, but augury involves watching a bird's flight patterns and then determining the future from that, whereas ornithomancy is literally counting the number of birds or the type of birds that you see, and then that has a prescribed meaning. And obviously, as I say, counting does give rise to plenty of magpie superstitions. Like I say, if you saw 3 in Essex, it meant death or a letter was coming. But alternatively, if you saw 5 magpies, if you had any silver coins with you, you should pass them from one hand to the other, which would then increase your wealth. Now, these superstitions are encoded as magpie rhymes, and there are loads of variations, so I know for a fact that people will have heard a different one that I haven't mentioned here. So obviously, if you do know a different one, feel free to post it in the comments on the blog post, or feel free to tweet me, whatever. But as I say, be aware that there will be versions that I'm not including here that you may know, but it's just because there's so many versions. Now, the earliest known example of a magpie rhyme comes from around about 1780 in Lincolnshire. And this one is 1 for sorrow, 2 for mirth, 3 for a wedding, 4 for a death. In other places they do swap death for birth, which ultimately would be a much better rhyming word with mirth. Now, in most versions, a single magpie is bad and 2 are favourable, and we see this again in a more popular variation, which is 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy. And a version in the Denham Tracts adds extra couplets after the usual 2. 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret not to be told, 8 for heaven, 9 for hell, and 10 is for the devil's own cell. Henderson relates 2 versions from Northern England. 1 is sorrow, 2 mirth, 3 a wedding, 4 a birth, 5 heaven, 6 hell, 7 the devil's own cell. And he also has another one. 1 is sorrow, 2 mirth, 3 a wedding, 4 a birth, 5 a sickening, 6 a christening, 7 a dance, 8 a lady going to France. Obviously, you can see there how ultimately it's a bit confusing that you would have 4 for a birth and then 6 for a christening, because you would think kind of one implies the other. But there we go, they're the 2 different versions from Northern England. Now, ultimately, I actually have heard the one that has the 7 for a secret not to be told in it, so it was quite interesting to come across versions that I'd never heard where I live. But there we go. These particular latter versions do reflect the penchant for darker options in Northern England in general. While Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud actually note that these rhymes haven't been traced back beyond 1780, but that's in terms of ones that have been written down, but the omens that sit behind them are actually medieval in origin, so we don't actually know how old this form of divination is going back beyond that. Some people thought that magpies chattering meant that guests were on the way, and other people thought that a group of magpies chattering on a rooftop was a sign of evil tidings. And interestingly, Marie Trevelyan notes that in Wales, the 1 for sorrow, 2 for mirth rhymes actually apply to crows rather than magpies. And also she further notes that 3 magpies signify a funeral, while 4 indicate a wedding. So it's quite interesting that then in Wales, they take the same divinations but then ascribe them to different numbers. So why the hatred of magpies? Well, according to Simpson and Roud, people in Sheffield thought that the magpie wouldn't enter Noah's Ark, and instead it basically sat on the roof chattering about the flood. If you've ever seen magpies together, you'll know that's probably what they would have done. But there's another belief that the magpie refused to wear full mourning at the crucifixion, obviously with the whole black and white thing it's got going on, and this might partially explain its cursed associations. And then there's another biblical explanation which actually considered the magpie to be sort of like a bit of a midway point between the raven and the dove, and as a result it hadn't been baptised during the biblical flood, and this could of course then explain why it's apparently such a cursed bird. Those in Sussex thought that magpies were nosy and gossiping birds, and some people actually thought that the souls of evil-minded people or gossiping women returned as magpies. Now, this probably comes more from their incredibly irritating chattering than anything else, but it also doesn't say a lot about the societal approaches towards women that they would then think they would come back as these chattering birds. That said, William Henderson relates an anecdote from an English traveller, and while in Sweden, the traveller saw magpies eating the food meant for the pigs. He offered to shoot the birds, but the farmer politely declined, because he didn't want any harm to befall him as a result. Now that's hardly surprising, given a Swedish belief that magpies were the birds of the witches, and one belief actually sees witches take the form of magpies while they travelled abroad on Walpurgisnacht. Now people thought of magpies as a bird of the underworld in Germany, and one Scottish belief claimed that magpies had a drop of the devil's blood on their tongues, which again would explain the chattering. Yet in ancient Rome, people associated the magpie with magic and fortune-telling, which, if true, could perhaps partially explain a little bit of an origin for their use in ornithomancy. And in ancient Greece, the magpie was sacred to Dionysus, god of wine. And of course, these are just European associations, and I do tend to stick to European lore on the podcast because that, of course, is my cultural background. Although, I did want to put this bit in because elsewhere, the magpie isn't such bad news after all, because in Korea and China, the bird brings good news, happiness and good fortune. So if you do like magpies, then you don't have to sit there going, they're not omens of death, because not everybody thinks that they are. But I do actually want to include an actual myth about magpies, and that's the fact that people believe that they've got this thing for shiny objects. And this in itself is potentially also a form of folklore, because research published in 2014 showed that magpies were actually afraid of shiny objects, and far from stealing them for their nest, they actually fed less around shiny things and often avoided them. Now, scientists do believe that this neophobia, or fear of new things, is understandable, because the birds don't recognise these objects, meaning that they could be dangerous to them, so they just avoid them instead. And it's believed that the myth of their preference for shiny objects is basically plain old confirmation bias. So people might see a magpie occasionally pick up something shiny, which confirms the folklore in their mind, but they ignore every time a magpie picks up something dull instead. Now, I should point out that the research did only assess magpie pairs, so they do think that it's possible that single magpies might still prove to be thieves to impress potential mates, but the research also only uncovered 2 published accounts online in which a magpie had stolen something shiny. We do obviously have to remember there is the opera La Gatta Ladra, which translates as the thieving magpie, which is all about a magpie that steals something and then gets humans into trouble. So it is also entirely possible that people have then taken this folkloric belief and it's appeared in culture and then they've just run with it. But as I say, the study does demonstrate that we shouldn't just pass on something that we hear out of hand if there isn't necessarily anything to back it up. Now, personally, I'm no fan of magpies, as you can probably tell, and I should be, because they lend their name to my local football team, Newcastle United, although anyone who's ever had a conversation with me would know that I know very little about football. But every year, the magpies in my area absolutely decimate the nests of songbirds, and they're also a menace on the bird feeders, and like I say, they're really, really noisy, and they bully the little birds, and that just doesn't sit well with me. But do I think that they're omens of death or bad luck? Probably only if you're a smaller bird and you have chicks in your nest. I've never had a magpie rhyme accurately predict the future, although I have never seen more than 4 at once, I should point out, which is why I think a lot of the really early couplets just go up to 4. But of course, you may have had a different experience, and if you have, I would absolutely love to hear about it. So you can tweet me, you can post comments on the blog post that this is for. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can just put a comment below the video and that's fine. So many ways to get in touch with me, and that's what's wonderful about the internet, I suppose. So if you have had an experience where you've seen, for example, say 3 magpies and then you've had a letter come or whatever, please do let me know, because that would be really quite cool to hear. And that was what was really interesting after the British Big Cats episode last week, and I think it wasn't quite obvious that I was sort of saying, yes, I know big cats exist and there probably are a few of them kicking around in Britain. I'm just not sure that they belong to the Ice Age. I don't know if that particular stance came across, but I was amazed how many people that I talk to on a regular basis have actually seen evidence of them. So that's quite cool. So who knows, maybe it's the same with the magpie rhymes. I'd love to find out. I've got a couple of announcements before I sign off this week. We are doing the illustrated talk tonight on Victorian mourning etiquette. So we are looking at mourning dolls, mourning samplers, fashion, hairwork, jewellery, all kinds of stuff that's fun for all the family. We are doing that tonight on Zoom if you are a Patreon supporter, and that is if you support at the £5 a month or higher tier. And it will be available as a replay if you can't make it. So if you become a supporter like next month or whatever, you will still get access to the ones I've done so far. I am going to be putting out the Patreon bonus podcast episode for those at the £3.50 a month or more tier, and that is going to be on prophets and seers, but I'm not including Nostradamus. Spoiler alert already. Next week, we are going to be starting the new theme for July, and that is going to be folklore in art, and how artists have basically used folklore within their paintings, how they've depicted mythological scenes, and how sometimes they just use folkloric details as well to kind of add to the visual narrative. So we are going to be looking at that next week, because that was quite a popular choice when I ran a poll on Twitter, and I'm any excuse to talk about art, and I am there like a shot. So I hope that you've enjoyed this week's episode. Like I say, if you know a different variation of the magpie rhyme, please do feel free to let me know. If you've got any requests, you know where the request form is, i.e. it's in the show notes. And I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next month, basically. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.